All right, very happy to be back with Senator Bruce Tarr, of course, and Bill Newell of MSO News Sports, and Senator Tarr, the Senate Minority Leader in the state of Massachusetts. Welcome, Senator Tarr. How are you today?
I'm doing great, and it's great to be on with you, Rick, and with you, Bill.
You know, we didn't talk the last couple of weeks, and so much goes on with respect to the pandemic, with respect to the election, with respect to so many things. But Governor Baker is having these frequent are they press conferences or press releases? But he is he's keeping the residents of Massachusetts up to date constantly on what's going on in the state.
He is, Rick, and it's very important. And the governor does regular updates. And in fact, we try to stream those updates on my social media channels so that people can see them there, as well as the televised broadcast of the updates. And there is so much information to be able to present. And it's important that people have that information, because throughout the pandemic, we've learned how very much this is a fluid situation and things can change very quickly. And so those updates I find to be very valuable, and I know others do too. And I think it's been an important element of how the governor has handled the COVID-19 pandemic, is by providing as much information as possible.
One of the things that I'm concerned with as I go running and walking, and we've been dining out, this has been such a spectacular summer that the shift to outdoor dining, with people putting their tables, restaurants putting their tables out in the streets, and cities and towns complying and putting up jersey barriers and lights and stringing that stuff. But we're rapidly entering a change of seasons now. What's going to happen?
Well, you know, that's a huge concern on Beacon Hill. And it's not that every restaurant has been able to do outdoor dining, but many have. And it's been able to mitigate some of the economic damage from not being able to run at full capacity in terms of dining rooms and eating spaces inside. So one of the things that's been happening is that the governor, through a recent executive order, extended some of the changes that were made to facilitate outdoor dining. And what I mean by that, Rick, were there's some regulatory changes that had to do with being able to have dining spaces on a sidewalk or in a parking lot. And those things will be extended by executive order. There's still local control, but municipalities are allowed to continue them at least into December, and pretty much through the end of the public health emergency that we're experiencing. Now, at some point, we know that those things lose their effect, because we are in New England, and outdoor dining is only practical for so long before cold weather and inclement weather begin to foreclose those possibilities. But it is important that the governor is saying that, you know, we want to make sure that we extend those things. And there's another element to it. And this is something that we've talked about a little bit before. But we had enacted changes, well, the governor did by executive order, and there's legislation also pending to be able to do this, to say that when a restaurant, which is licensed to have alcohol service inside, wants to serve outside, that the process is simplified so that the local licensing board makes that change, notifies the Alcoholic Beverage Control Commission at the state level, but that's the end of the process. It's basically done at the local level. And so one of the other things the governor has done by executive order is extend that change, again, to be able to allow outdoor dining to continue, as opposed to having those license changes, those temporary license changes, only be viable until November 1st. So in terms of regulatory changes that have been made, and in terms of the licensing change that was made with regard to alcoholic beverages, those things have been extended in the hope that, again, we can squeeze out some additional time to be able to help restaurants that have been so negatively affected by the pandemic. Now, there is one more piece to this, Rick and Bill, and that is that the state government, through the Massachusetts Department of Transportation, through the Baker-Polito administration, has also been trying to provide resources to recognize the fact that there may need to be some modification. So, for instance, Rick, you mentioned placement of jersey barriers to be able to make the sidewalk a little bit wider, or the non-vehicular space a little bit bigger. And so there's a grant program called Shared Streets and Spaces that's been run. It started in June. It's roughly a 100-day program. And the last application deadline is September 22nd. Now, municipalities have to make the application. But what we've seen is that they often are doing it with either individual businesses or groups of businesses to be able to get some resources, again, for what are largely temporary changes, whether it be rerouting a street so that it's traffic free to allow restaurants to place tables in the street, or extending the sidewalk, or something that we've had a few calls about in our office lately, being able to get those very large heaters that are used in outdoor spaces to be able to make them a little bit more hospitable in colder weather. Those are eligible as well. And just to give you a sense, in the last round of grant awards, and I wrote down the number so I could recite it accurately, there was about $689,000 that was distributed. And again, this is on a rolling basis. I believe the program has a $5 million total. So we want to let people know that that's out there. And again, it's an attempt to help a sector of our economy that's been hurt very badly by the pandemic.
Bruce, are the restaurateurs concerned how the outdoor dining will go with the space creeping out to the roads when the snow plows have to come by in a few months here?
Very much so, Bill. And you know, it's a situation
I waited all that time for that question. I'm sorry.
Well, I appreciate your patience, and I would say that they certainly won't be endeavoring to serve snow cones with some of that raw material. But again, this is a very, very difficult situation. And we had heard from the Restaurant Association several months ago a prediction that as many as 1 in 5 restaurants in Massachusetts would not be able to reopen. And you can see that that's begun to happen with a lot of high-profile closures, particularly ones that have been reported in the Boston media markets that have taken some people by surprise because of the high-profile nature of some of the restaurants that are closing. We've more recently heard, Bill, that that number could go up to 2 in 5 restaurants just because the situation is so difficult. And so for a while, we've had this rather unique tool of outdoor dining that's been able to help. But a lot of us are very, very concerned as those snowplows start to roll by, what's going to happen to the restaurants who don't have that option any longer, not because it isn't allowed by state and local government, and not because we haven't made the appropriate regulatory changes, but just because the climate won't allow it to happen.
But on a more serious note, and I apologize for that question, but when will they get increased indoor capacity? I mean, what's the deal on that?
So that's a great question, Bill, and it seems to me that we won't start to see that kind of an increase until we get into phase 4, which depends on the development either of a vaccine and or therapeutic drugs to be able to combat COVID-19. So we're looking at that taking quite a while. But I will say this, we're looking at a lot of different options to help. And so one of the questions that's been raised by a lot of restaurants all across the state is, what do we do with the space that we had committed in the past to bars, which take up a significant amount of floor space in the restaurant, but which we now cannot use because we cannot serve just alcohol without serving food. And so in my office, we're actually working with a group of restaurants who are coming up with a plan to say, here's how we can transition what has been bar space into dining space, so that we get a little bit more flexibility to be able to keep people apart and use space that isn't able to be used now. So we are all continuing to think about what are the ways that we can do things that will help restaurants in this very dark time. And along the same lines, one of the other things that the governor has done by executive order is allowed the opening of arcades and coin-operated amusements, not just in dedicated facilities like an indoor or an outdoor arcade, but also in those facilities like restaurants that may have something that's coin-operated that might help them generate a little bit more income. So again, it's a no stone left unturned approach.
Senator, my final question concerning this week's information, I guess, from your office is what the heck is going on at the registry? I haven't been able to get out to do things I'm supposed to do with my car and so on, but I did see something on tartalk.com that has to do with license renewal and what's called the Real ID.
So this requires a little bit of explanation, Rick, so I ask you to bear with me. But in the events following the attacks of 9/11, which we just commemorated not that long ago, there was a special commission formed to look at how to make us less vulnerable to terrorist attacks on domestic soil. And one of the recommendations that was made by that bipartisan group was to strengthen the reliability of driver's licenses as a form of identification. You may recall that the bombers that, or the terrorists that boarded the planes to bomb the buildings with the planes in New York City, when they did that at Logan Airport, many of them used a driver's license as a means of boarding an airplane. And so the recommendation was made, but it took years to try to get a clear direction on how to implement that recommendation. And states did it at varying time frames. Massachusetts has been one of the last to be able to enact Real ID, but we have, and it requires some very special things like additional documentation. And one of the other things it requires, Rick, is for you to have a Real ID license, you have to present in person at a registry of motor vehicles office. Now, clearly right now, there aren't a lot of appointments and there isn't a lot of availability of in-person time, even at branches that are open. And so in order to make things a little bit easier, what the Registry of Motor Vehicles has done is to say that if you renew your license now online, your traditional license that you've had, then the $25 fee to upgrade to the Real ID, when you can do that again in an in-person way in the registry, will be waived. Now, there are some specific time frames around this, but generally speaking, you can renew your license in advance, and you can also get the Real ID after the public health emergency is over. So to be able to take advantage of this, the idea is let's take pressure off of registry in-person visits now, and then within a reasonable time after the expiration of the public health emergency because of the pandemic, you can go in person, upgrade your license, and not pay an economic penalty for doing that.
Senator Tarr, I have one last question. And, this past week, some districts have seen students go back into schools for the first time on a very limited basis, the hybrid model. Others are completely remote, as you know. So maybe, do you have an observation or any thoughts regarding the, what's happening with the schools reopening in the state at this point regarding the COVID-19?
I have a couple, Bill, and I appreciate the question. Number one, there is no one size fits all. School districts are dealing with the situation on a very much individualized basis. Obviously, they're reporting to the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education what they're doing, and they're getting technical support and guidance, but they are very much making local decisions. And I would also say, as observation number two, that some of those decisions are highly controversial. There are very strongly held positions, oftentimes by people on the side of returning to in-person learning in the schools, and strong positions among people who think that there should only be remote learning. So there's a landscape out there that has a number of different permutations. In fact, within some districts, there are both of those things that I just described. But the other thing and the last thing that I would observe is that it's a changeable situation. So if we see a change in transmission rates in a community or an outbreak of a cluster of COVID-19, then sometimes that requires a change in course for school districts that are in the communities where some of those things have occurred. So it's a very dynamic situation. And one of the newest things, Bill, that we are looking into in my office is connectivity, and making sure that if we are going to have students learning remotely, that they can do so effectively and that they have a good internet connection. And that, despite the fact that we live in an age when we all depend on the internet, isn't always a given, particularly when you see large volumes of data flowing through the system. It isn't always a given that we're going to have good connectivity for students. And in our office, we're just starting to look at that and to understand what